Joining us today is Elliot Malin, an attorney and policy strategist, founder of Alpine Strategies and chair of Nevada's Holocaust Education Advisory Council. He's been a leading legal voice pushing back on the misuse of genocide and international law. And today we're breaking down what the law actually says. Elliot, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here with you.
Thank you. Before we get into the law, most people don't know your background yet. You're a lawyer, a policy strategist, and you work in Holocaust and genocide education. How did you personally end up stepping into the Israel conversation?
I think that's just being Jewish. I'm in a unique position where I'm one of very few people who have codified the Genocide Convention's Article 2, which is the actual definition of genocide. And on October 7th and after October 7th, it dawned on me, and as somebody that is Jewish, and all of us, every single Jew in the world was personally affected. We all knew somebody, right? It dawned on me that Hamas had committed genocide, that a true statement today is that the Holocaust, the Shoah, is no longer the most recent genocide of Jews. It is October 7th. And then we saw that the language was being twisted. And that twisting was very interesting. It started off with the South Africa case. It didn't actually start with the South Africa case. I'll never forget, 2 weeks after October 7th, Israel hadn't even invaded Gaza yet. There was a protest in my hometown accusing Israel of genocide. It was almost immediate. And that really opened my eyes to what we were seeing and the importance of pushing back.
What do you think is the single biggest misunderstanding that people have about what genocide actually means under international law?
I think the single biggest misunderstanding is that people don't know what genocide is, period. It's not just under international law. Genocide as a term was created in law. There is no other meaning than the one that was prescribed to it by Raphael Lemkin and the drafters of the Genocide Convention. And we find that in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And I have these conversations frequently. For example, I was at the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles recently, and there was a girl there on her 16th birthday. She chose to go to the Museum of Tolerance. She was from Illinois. I believe she was from Skokie, which I found to be very interesting because the Illinois Holocaust Museum is in Skokie. And she and her dad traveled specifically to Los Angeles to go to the Museum of Tolerance. And she did that instead of getting a car for her 16th birthday. And then I sat there and she was with a docent and I asked the question. I said, excuse me, and I apologize for jumping in, but can I ask you a question? After going through this museum, could you tell me what genocide is in your own words? And she gave me what she thought it was. And I said, I appreciate you telling me that, but that's not what it is. Genocide is a very specific term of art. It's an act with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And we had a very good conversation about what that is. What does that mean today? But it is the single biggest critique I have is that people don't know what it actually means.
So genocide, as you said, is a legal term with a strict definition, and most people out there just think it's a moral accusation. Why do you think that is?
I think we have a fundamental flaw in Holocaust and genocide education. People could tell you what the Holocaust was, right? The murder of Jews. But why was it genocide? What made it genocide? It wasn't necessarily the large number of dead Jews. It was the intention to destroy Jews as a people. And that's not something we've ever really taught. And I think that has been a fundamental flaw in this entire conversation. And it's interesting, right? People now just think it's a large amount of people dead in war. And I think that, one, you can be horrified by war. You should be horrified by war. Every war should be horrifying to you. Even a just war is horrifying. World War II was a just war, but look what happened to Europe. Look what happened to Japan, to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And you can be horrified by it, but not jump to the worst possible crime. And so it was this example. Martin Shaw is a sociologist, famous, I wouldn't call him famous, world-renowned sociologist. He's supposed to be an expert on genocide. Well, his premise has always been that we should change what genocide is. In every one of his books, he says it's too difficult to find genocide, so we have to change it. But he's also said that Israel's committing genocide. And we had a conversation. He's like, well, 70,000 plus people have been killed. But that's not necessarily what the law says, right? It's in whole or in part, and it's an act with the intent. And in that conversation, I was like, okay, but what is 70,000 in relation to the whole of Gaza? The population pre-war was estimated to be about 2.23 million. 70,000 is 3.14%. It is pi percent of the population. Under the case law, the law that we have that defines what in part means, a Kristic decision from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, says that you have to, in part means that it is so substantial, it has to be so substantive to threaten the existence of the group. So the very group's very existence must be threatened. Well, 3%, 3.14% doesn't threaten the existence of the Palestinians in Gaza. On the converse side of that, though, right, when we look at when I said earlier, October 7th was genocide, if you look at the substantive population decrease in some of the kibbutzim, Be'eri and Nir Oz, the various places attacked, it was so substantial that the real population has fallen substantially. And that's kind of a difference. And it's not necessarily a numbers game. The law says in the jurisprudence that you must look at this information and account for what the destruction is compared to the whole. So it's not just that 70,000. What is that 70,000 compared to the 2.23 million? And that has been a fundamental problem within the field.
Words like genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, they carry such unique power. They're all accusations against Israel. Is there somebody out there, pushing these claims? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think Amnesty International is pushing these claims. And I think it's because as an NGO, a non-governmental organization, they need to try to be relevant. But what are they doing in Sudan? What are they doing for the Uyghurs in China, right? Look, genocide as a term invented by Raphael Lemkin, we often say that he invented it in reaction to the Holocaust. That's a partial truth. He invented it in reaction to the Armenian genocide because he saw what the Ottomans did to the Armenians. And then it came to a forefront when it happened to his community, right? A prominent Jewish international lawyer. And one of the first acts of the United Nations General Assembly was to pass a resolution calling for the establishment of a treaty to criminalize and punish genocide. And so we make this law, this international law, in response to the Holocaust. I think that what you are seeing is a psychological problem and phenomenon right now where people want to twist and misalign the word that was invented in response to the worst massacre of Jews in history and make the Jews the perpetrators of the crime committed against them. And I do think it's fascinating because, again, legally, Hamas committed genocide on October 7th. That's the only genocide that's been committed in this conflict, in this war. So to twist that is a very interesting juxtaposition from these entities and these individuals. And I think that you're seeing that there are entities around the world who are politically aligned further to the left, that this progressive bend with these NGOs is actually trying to change the law. And something that we've seen, and I'm harping on genocide, but you also asked about two other crimes, right? And we'll get to those. But something we've seen in every accusation of genocide where somebody put out a report, and we'll start with Amnesty. Amnesty actually started with what's called the actus reus, the act of the harm, and then used the actus reus to infer the harm. That's not how the law works either. There's a Ptolemy decision from ICTY that gives us the only reasonable inference test. Bosnia v. Serbia from not ICTY, that's an ICJ case, also uses the only reasonable inference test, right? And so they attempt to twist this law, and Amnesty did it. B'Tselem said, and I believe this is a direct quote, that they broaden the analytical framework. If you have to broaden the analytical framework from what exists, that means what exists cannot find the conclusion that you have. It means that you are starting from a place of conclusion and not a place of analysis. That should never hold up in any court. And it's not just them. Human Rights Watch did the same thing. I'm a member of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, which didn't actually assess intent. It assumed intent based off of all these other things. And then you had the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, and I had a fascinating conversation with a member of Congress about that yesterday, also doing the same thing. They didn't assess intent. In fact, the only time that Commission of Inquiry report even mentioned a possible explanation of tunnel infrastructure as to why that destruction exists was to try to discount the tunnel infrastructure. But the tunnel specifically that they cited was the tunnel that Mohammed Sinwar was killed in under the European hospital. And the Geneva Conventions are very clear on what the law permits and what it doesn't permit. And people are choosing to ignore that. And so I think that there is a movement to try to redefine what the word means and what the crime is. And that's what we're seeing with genocide. Now with apartheid, I think it's also true. Apartheid is race-based discrimination. And it is typically what you're seeing is citizens of a state being discriminated against for the purpose of destruction to try to push them out. That is what South Africa did, right? Well, if that were to be true for Israel, that would have to apply within the Israeli borders for Arab Israeli citizens or Palestinian Israeli citizens, right? As some people call them. That would mean that Arab Palestinians who are citizens of Israel cannot be members of the Knesset. They cannot serve on the Supreme Court. They cannot be generals in the IDF. all of these things that they have a right to do, and even participated in the last majority government, right? And so you're seeing this twist and this constant twist of the word. And I think that the reason it's being done is to try to misalign Israel and Jews as a whole, as we saw now with Bondi Beach and repeatedly. Now, with ethnic cleansing, I find this one to be the most fascinating. Ethnic cleansing is a very poorly defined word in law. It's established in a UN General Assembly resolution, but it's really about the trying to expel an ethnic group to make a geographic region ethnically homogenous. Well, for Israel to ethnically cleanse Gaza, it would actually require the expulsion of Palestinians and then the importation of Israelis. That's how you make it ethnically homogenous with that new group. That's not something it's doing or ever has done. In fact, as we all know, famously, the only time it's ever ethnically cleansed a place is of its own people in Gaza in 2005. And so I think what we're seeing right now is these groups and entities that want to be relevant, that need to switch the law and shift it so that way they can convict the Jews in public opinion, and the court of public opinion likely fail in the court of law.
Is this the first time in history, in your knowledge, that this legal language is being used as a political slogan to smear a democratic country?
No, look, people do that all the time to other countries too, in other states. People say that about the United States sometimes. I think this is the first time in history that it is so systemic, but that is what makes this unique. There are other accusations of genocide that go around, right? Here's a great example, Cambodia. We kind of collectively recognize Cambodia as a genocide. My question is, was it? Because genocide only protects against 4 groups, right? Ethnicity, nationality, religion, and race. In Cambodia, Pol Pot was trying to make an agrarian society. His goal wasn't to destroy a group, it was to try to force an integration into this political ideology. That's a different crime. And I think that's another flaw within this, right? And it's a little unique here too, because at the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor sought warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant for the crime against humanity of extermination. That was expressly rejected. In Cambodia, I think it would be granted, because the elements are different.
What about the United Nations, singling out Israel more so than any other country, by far? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental flaw with an entity like the United Nations that is run inherently democratic, but a majority of the states are totalitarian dictatorships. So they get to control the agenda and the conversation. Why is Iran on the Human Rights Council when it's one of the worst abusers of human rights in the world, right? Why does North Korea get to be on it? The previous Syrian regime was on it. We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? And when we use these institutions like the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Council as this appeal to authority, because it's supposed to be this thing that's good and inherently good. A few years ago in the United States, the United Nations was sued. The case was dismissed, not because of anything other than they have sovereign immunity, but the United Nations is culpable for the deaths of thousands of people in Haiti and spreading disease there. This is not inherently a good institution. Like, the intent is to create an institution that brings about peace, but it hasn't done that. And I think that, as I told a member of Congress yesterday, a Democratic member of Congress, we have to have a real conversation about the role of the United Nations. I'm not saying we destroy or get rid of the United Nations, but we need to be honest about the United Nations and what it does and the way it acts. Why is there standing agenda item number 7 for the UN Human Rights Council, which regularly bashes Israel, a democratic state? And I'm not to say that Israel is a perfect country and state. It's not. It's a state run by man. It's not a state run by God, right? We are all inherently flawed in that we make sometimes poor decisions. My mom tells me that all the time. But why is it that that's the state that's getting condemned 70 times a year? But Russia, where its actions in Bucha, where every man was found dead with their hands tied behind their backs and a bullet to the head, not routinely condemned. The forcible transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia, not condemned. That's an act of genocide if you can find the intent. Both of those. You have to ask what we're doing here.
Do you think that most reporters, journalists understand the legal meaning of genocide? Or
no, I think that you have PR firms that are pumping this stuff out and they're just running with it. For example, when the International Association of Genocide Scholars published its resolution, they said majority passed this preeminent organization on genocide scholars. Well, as a member, you don't have to be an expert on genocide to join. In fact, you can just pay $30. When they said a majority of members, 500 people are members, but only 129 voted. I think there is a inherent disinformation campaign that is informing the media, and the media is running with it.
So, in plain English, what are the legal elements required to prove genocide, and why is it considered, the gravest crime in international law?
So I think it's important to take a step back because we talked about how the numbers and people always say, oh, the numbers, that's what makes it genocide. No. And it's also why I always ask people to define it for me, right? Which I did earlier. Genocide is what we call an intent crime. It requires a very specific intent, dolus specialis. You must intend to destroy a protected group, national, ethnical, racial, or religious, in whole or in part as such. So the reason why is that they are that group. You are targeting for their membership in that group, and you intend to destroy them in whole or in part for their membership in that group. That's what the as such means, right? How many you kill is ultimately not entirely relevant. It is the intent that is the most relevant. Now, I have been in that argument with Martin Shaw and a few others over the last few days about the numbers do matter. Part of that is true. When you're looking at Israel's control of Gaza for the last 2 years, they have the ability to commit genocide. They have the real control. If they wanted to commit genocide, it would be like that. So 3.14%, that's where we look at that. Do they intend that harm? And under the analysis, you cannot show that. Now, people have actually shifted. This has been very interesting because there's 5 acts of genocide, and those are very specific too, right? Killing members of the group is only one of the 5 acts. In fact, one of the acts I just alluded to in my Russia-Ukraine comment is forcibly transferring children from one group to the next. Another act is working to prevent births in the group. Another is causing serious mental harm for the purpose of destroying the group. The other is mental and physical, and the other is destroying basically infrastructure for the group so that the group cannot sustain. So now you're seeing people shift their focus from, well, the number dead is genocide to, well, look at the amount of buildings destroyed. Because you've destroyed so many buildings, it's genocide. Well, I made a comment earlier about the test for inference. It's called the only reasonable inference test, meaning that can be the only explanation. And you see a lot of people saying that's not true. It can have multiple explanations. No, it's the only reasonable inference. That's very, very specific. And when we don't assess the tunnel infrastructure, the existence of hostages, the utilization of human shielding, it moves the agency, and agency is the responsibility from one party to the next. And I think that is actually something that's been very harmful in this war, is we always talked about the alleged crimes committed against Palestinians by Israelis. We always talk about the alleged crimes committed by Palestinians against Israelis, right? We never talk about the alleged crimes committed against Palestinians, by Hamas. Human shielding is a crime, right? We don't talk about that. We don't talk about it as a criminal act. And we don't talk about what does the law permit when that happens. Under Article 28 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it expressly says that a combatant party who utilizes this tactic is not immunized from harm. That means that you can attack that place. Under Additional Protocol 1, Article 51, Sub 7, it says the exact same thing, right? And so when we look at this and when we look at genocide and what are these possible explanations, why is this harm happening? We're not saying that Palestinians aren't suffering. They are. We're not monsters. That is something we recognize. But part of the problem is that the responsible party is not getting the blame. And it's being shifted to, well, Israel dropped the bomb, so Israel's at fault. But again, what does the law say? And so in layman's terms, what is Israel's intent? And how do you prove that that is what Israel intends?
So it's clear from what you're saying, obviously, there's a double standard against Israel. Hamas is the one that's committing all these crimes. Why is it that, nobody speaks about this? Is it because of the media or propaganda? What else could it be?
All of the above. Look, let's take a step back in history in time, about 2 years, to October 17th, 2023. On that day, an explosion happened at the Al-Ali hospital, right? On the front page of every news station, the ticker was 500 to 700 people dead. Israel bombs hospital. We didn't take a step back and ask for the facts. That caused a synagogue in Berlin to be firebombed. It caused an ancient synagogue in Tunisia to be destroyed. It caused riots in Amman. But the truth is that a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket misfired, hit the parking lot, and killed 50 to 70 people. That is substantially less than 500 to 700. We were told that the hospital was destroyed. Turns out the hospital was fully intact, right? And so I think part of that is the reporting. The reporting has been lazy. It's caused real harm. And it's something, again, having the conversation with Professor Shaw was, these are blood libels. And I said the same thing to that Democrat member of Congress. This accusation of genocide is a blood libel. And I got a pushback. They're like, well, no, it's not. It's against the Israeli government, not the Israeli people or the Jewish people. And I said, No, we're going to stop that. One, it's based off of a lie. And two, it is causing Jews to be murdered around the world. It is by definition a blood libel. And the media is the one running with it because it gets clicks. Look at Piers Morgan, right? Look at who he brings on. He's not doing this because he wants an honest conversation. Why do you bring Nick Fuentes onto and have a one-on-one conversation? It's because you want the rage bait clicks. You want the sound bites. You're not presenting anything that is helpful. These are harmful people. It's the same thing. Jake Shields, that former UFC fighter who probably has CTE, was questioning if the Holocaust happened and he was being platformed. I think that it is unethical reporting from NGOs, from the media, and from our governments. Our governments know a lot more than they're telling people, and they're not correcting the record because they're afraid of the politics.
You speak a little bit about Rwanda and Srebrenica, which are, I guess, the benchmark for genocide cases. What percentage of that population was destroyed? How quickly did it unfold? And why does that even matter?
That's a great question. So in Rwanda, it was estimated that 80% of the Rwandan Tutsi population was murdered in 100 days. That was about 800,000 people in 100 days. So when we talk about the impart conversation again, and we see something so substantial that actually threatens the very existence of the group. Now, when we talk about Srebrenica, this is very interesting because I got into a weird debate about this morning. Somebody was like, you're talking about this, but the court was talking about the enclave. And I'm like, correct. 20 to 30% of the Bosnian Muslim population in Srebrenica was murdered in a matter of weeks. It was very quick. The massacre was a very quick event. It also happened after the ceasefire. That is another key indicator in Srebrenica that was genocide. There was no armed conflict that was supposed to be happening. It had ended. This was supposed to be a safe space. And they went through and they murdered 20 to 30%, all of them military age men or boys. Your closest to Gaza is Srebrenica. On the low end is 20%. But 20% is still significantly higher than 3.14%. Now, if we were to say, you know what, let's give credence to those studies that it's 100,000, that's still 5%. You're not getting to even 10%. And this is very important because people are like, whoa, it's so substantial. It's a lot of people, but is it so substantial to threaten the very existence of the group? And the answer is no. In Srebrenica, because they had destroyed and killed so many of the men, it makes it hard to repopulate. You kind of need men to do that. That is how that works. In Rwanda, it was 80%. It was almost total. And so I think that when we talk about those and we look at them as comparative examples, it's important to put those into context and understand what we're looking at as a whole.
So now what happens when people compare Gaza to Rwanda and Srebrenica? And what does ignoring precedent do to international law?
Oh man, that's a tough question, but good one. So when you make the comparison, you have to look at the facts, right? Well, how are these similar? Are they similar? We don't have any similarities between the two. We really don't. It's very interesting. I've seen some people use the appeal to authority of saying, well, I survived Srebrenica. And there was one person, a woman, who said that. And I said, that's very interesting because she started accusing Israel of genocide in October 2023. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition because you're not thinking through what made Srebrenica genocide. And the courts were very, very narrow and very, very strict on that. And I think people would do well to understand that. A lot of what we're seeing, and Ireland did this, by the way, in their ICJ filing, where they advocate for shifting the intent standard, saying it's too stringent. The court has no history of doing that. In fact, historically, they go and they look at what the drafters intended, which is what you're supposed to do with the law. And it is intended to be very difficult to find genocidal intent. It is a fully conclusive analysis. There can be no other explanations besides genocide for your intent analysis. And that's something I think a lot of people don't understand. That bar is very, very, very high. And so what people are doing is trying to shift the law in what we would call an ex post facto manner, meaning that's not the law when the crime occurred, alleged crime occurred, but it's the law now. So we're going to convict you of the law now, even though you committed this when you didn't know it was illegal. In any fair court in the world, that is not permissible. In the United States directly, that's unconstitutional. You cannot do that. And so what they're trying to do is to change it ex post facto so that way they can say, well, Israel committed genocide, because they know that the elements as they are today cannot be met. If you have to ask the court to change the law to make the finding, it means that the law doesn't support your finding.
Okay, let's speak a little bit about the casualty numbers in Gaza and distinguishing civilians from combatants and why that matters so much?
So my estimate, and it's a rough estimate, is 25,000 combatants. Now, some people will say that there's no way that you can substantiate that. I keep a spreadsheet of this information where every time we say we get information of wherever the deaths are, if it is the Ministry of Health in Gaza, run by Hamas, says this is how many dead there are, that's the number I'm working with. When Israel says we've killed dozens of combatants, I put that into my spreadsheet. That's 24 dozens, right? That's 2 dozen. That's my minimum, dozens. And then we get other information as it comes in. And so there's a few other things that we're missing. There has not been a single reported natural death in Gaza in over 2 years. We know that that total number should be about 13,000 because we can calculate how many people are expected to die monthly. My hunch is there is a large portion of that included in the death toll. Evidence is very hard to come by on this. Everybody is martyred and was killed by Israel. But there's also other instances in the death toll that we know that these people were killed by Hamas, right? And so differentiating these things is what's the harm committed by Israel and what's the harm committed by Hamas and what's the harm, the non-harm, what are the natural deaths, non-violent deaths? And it's also important, because we should mention it too, the excess natural deaths should be recorded as violent. So excess deaths that wouldn't have happened but for the war, they can't get insulin, so they died, that should be counted as a violent death. They wouldn't have died otherwise. So in the math of that, we're at about 70,000 total dead. If we were to say that all of them are all natural deaths, which is again about 13,000 are included, that would reduce this to about 57,000 violent deaths. Now, again, my estimate is 25,000 combatants. That would put that at about 1,000 civilians. So it's very close to 1-to-1, but it's not exactly 1-to-1. When we look at, again, we're talking about the destruction of a people. Why are these people being killed, right? Why are they being harmed? And so we look at this and we look at how Hamas conducts itself in fighting. Again, I mentioned human shielding is illegal. It does not immunize a party. People often don't know what proportionality means in war either. Right. And that's this is a very important part of this entire thing and a part of the law, is that proportionality is an assessment done. It's prospective and only ever prospective. It is never retrospective. It is done by the commander who orders the attack at the time the order is given, based off of the relevant information he has. So I'm in my office right now. Say that there's a tunnel underneath me. There's a drone ready to fire at my office because of that tunnel underneath me. The commander doesn't know that I am here. Doesn't know anybody in my office is here. Say it's Saturday. We're not supposed to be here on Saturday, but we're here. But there are Hamas combatants underneath us. We are what is called an incidental harm. Our deaths would be incidental to the strategic military advantage. And if the strategic military advantage outweighs the incidental harm, then it is a proportional strike, right? And that's something that people don't understand and how that works. And truthfully, it is horrific, right? We're justifying innocent lives being taken, but that's how the law works. And so when we look at the death toll, it helps. I don't want to say it's completely informative, but it helps guide us into what we're looking at. And what we're seeing is not murder of people based off of their identity. We're not seeing murder, period. We're seeing an urban war setting, one of the most complicated urban war settings ever to exist. No military has fought a combatant like Hamas, where they've been so deeply embedded within civilian and humanitarian infrastructure. And so we are actually expecting higher civilian casualties. And again, the question becomes, who is culpable? Who's at fault? I would say that's Hamas, because they're the ones breaking the law by utilizing human shielding.
I had interviewed your friend, Major Andrew Fox, a couple weeks ago, and he mentioned that he was part of a study. They looked at the lists of deaths, and there were many names there twice. There were errors. There was adults that were counted as children, and actually Hamas retracted, a bunch of those names. Could you speak a little bit about that, about the discrepancies in their lists as well?
Yeah, I think I was part of that study too. So that's where we know that some of these people that are being said to have been killed by Israel weren't. We caught somebody on the list, if I recall correctly, that had been killed by cancer a few years ago, right? There are a lot of discrepancies, and Hamas has tried to clean them up because people started asking questions. We've seen yesterday, Alois Eisenberg put it out, and this was from the Palestinians themselves, showing that the death toll is actually majority men. And for, again, 2 years, we've been told that it is majority women and children. That has not shifted. Every time, it is always a majority women and children. But that's actually not what the Palestinian health ministries show. It is over 50% men, right? And so I think that our study helped become a catalyst for this because there are a lot of discrepancies. There's a lot of information missing. There's a lot of people listed as something if I recall correctly. We saw people's ages bumped down, so that way they would be a minor. So try to increase the children casualties. One of the problems we have as well is we don't know when a person under the age of 18 has been utilized in combat or for warfighting purposes. And that does change a lot about the law. If they're 15 or over, it changes versus if they're 14 and under as well. So there's a lot of relevance there. There's just no information that they're giving us. And everybody's relying on this. And again, something that's very interesting to me is people say 70,000 dead, all murdered. Oh, murder again means something. And what you're saying to me is not a single combatant has been killed in 2 years of war. Not one. Where are they? We have videos of them being killed. We have evidence that Yahya Sinwar is dead, that Mohammed Sinwar is dead, Mohammed Daif is dead. These are combatants. Where's the information on combatant deaths? And so there's another thing that we've seen is that Hamas themselves in Gaza has told families to not report on the deaths of a loved one who was a combatant, not to put up a martyr poster, because we're finding that those people are in the death toll and in the death lists. And so it is a very interesting, again, juxtaposition of what's going on in the information space, because there's that question. And I remember early on, the AP had to correct a report they put out, and the way that they corrected it was Hamas-run health ministry does not differentiate between civilians and combatants. And that has become a standard thing, but they don't tell you anything more than that. And so people assume 70,000 innocent people have been killed. Well, that's not true.
Many people say the ICG ruled genocide is plausible. What did the ICG actually say? And what is the difference between plausible rights and a finding of genocide?
Oh, great question. So the plausibility standard is extremely low. It is the lowest bar that you have to meet. It is on the floor. It is so low. In the ICJ, the only thing that you have to show at that point in time is that there is a dispute between two parties. They agree that there's a dispute, and they have agreed that there's jurisdiction. That is it. All they have to show is that they have a plausible dispute. Now, a former ICJ president, Joan Donoghue, who wrote that, a decision, by the way, went on the BBC and said, everybody's lying about what we said. Not in so much words, but basically saying, this is all wrong. What we decided was not that there was plausible genocide, but that there were plausible rights that could be infringed. That is an objectively true statement. We have a dispute. Now the question is, are Palestinians protected under the Genocide Convention? Do they have plausible rights that could be infringed? The answer is yes. Palestinians as a nation of people, a national group, are protected under the Genocide Convention. So we have a dispute between two state parties, and we have plausible rights that exist. So we have a plausible case. That is all that was ruled. The ICJ explicitly said, we are not ruling on the facts or the law, but everybody ignored that sentence. It was very interesting because, again, let's actually shift that a little bit, and I apologize for doing this. So the ICC, right? What people don't understand about granting warrants is the request for warrants is only done in light most favorable to the prosecutor. The potential defendant does not get a right to rebut a request for warrants. So what the pretrial chamber sees is the information presented by the prosecutor that is in light favorable to the prosecutor. If a prosecutor brings forward a warrant request and they are denied, there is a fundamental problem in that because they have a very, one, low standard to grant a warrant, and two, there's no right to rebut. So they have everything that they can say, this is the evidence, here's the elements, this is what I think happened. So when it's rejected, it's a problem for them. That's embarrassing. And so also, what's the standard for granting that warrant? Well, that standard is also exceedingly low. It is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not that. It's just, does the evidence say that this could have happened? Yeah, maybe. That's effectively all this is. And so something that happened that's very interesting to the ICC cases against Netanyahu and Gallant is that they actually rejected a majority of the warrant requests. They only gave a few. And all of that was based on hearsay. And hearsay, for a fun fact for people, is permissible in grand juries. So if somebody goes to a grand jury to try to get an indictment and a warrant for an arrest, you can present hearsay. There is, again, a right to rebut here. And so we know that the warrant requests were based on hearsay. They have a really high burden now to prove that those are true. If Netanyahu were to ever show up and that case ever proceeded, my bet, 95% he gets acquitted. And that's not something people understand or say, right? It's not just that he gets acquitted. It's on all of the alleged charges: intentional starvation, murder, targeting of civilians, because it doesn't take into account the other side of it. What are the defenses here? What does the law say? And it's very interesting. So I think it's important to look at both the ICJ and the ICC and what these things are happening at the same time and what people are saying, because it's a demonstration that they don't fundamentally no. And that, again, at the ICC, extermination was actually rejected.
Do you think international courts are increasingly used as political weapons? And what happens to real victims when lawfare replaces actual law?
A great question. So the ICJ is inherently a political body. The judges are elected by the United Nations General Assembly and approved by the United Nations Security Council. And they shift the seats based off of geography. So Africa gets a seat, South America, so on and so forth. And the judges come from states who are affected by decisions. So at times they're going to want to stack the court the most favorable to them. The ICC, on the other side of that, doesn't have a backstop. The prosecutor can run rampant and do what he wants. And that's a problem. There's a few issues here with the ICC. There's one, complementarity, and they rejected the argument from Israel on complementarity the other day. I think that they have a fundamentally flawed understanding of complementarity, which is that it requires that a independent judiciary be willing and able to investigate an alleged crime. The judiciary might not agree that there's an alleged crime, but the ICC has said, well, they're not investigating, so we are. That's not how that really works. And so they are weaponizing it for political purposes, and that is harmful. I raised an issue, and I'll clue you in on something that I'm working on right now, is I have a client who is a Palestinian. Why is it that nobody has ever discussed the crimes committed by Palestinians against Palestinians? Why is it when we have evidence of torture, if the Palestinians can actually accede to the Rome Statute and grant jurisdiction, why is it that there's never been a warrant request for Palestinian criminals against Palestinian victims? Where's the warrant for torture? Where's the warrant for extrajudicial killing? Where's the warrant for murder? Where's the warrant for human shielding? That's also a Rome Statute crime. Where are these? If justice is only going one way, then that's not justice at all. And it really calls into question why that court should ever exist in the first place.
You filed at the ICC against Iranian leaders. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, we filed a Article 15 complaint, myself and a friend, Eli Rosenbaum. We filed that Iranian leaders are culpable for the crimes that Hamas committed. They financed, trained, armed, provided intelligence, and at times directly controlled Hamas. They knew about October 7th beforehand. If Hamas committed genocide, then Iran is culpable for that crime. And so we represented the relative of some victims, Marie Schneider, whose sister, brother-in-law were murdered, Kibbutz Neroz, whose niece and two nephews were taken hostage and murdered. And if we can't be honest about what genocide is and who is actually culpable for it, then we're not protecting anybody. That Hamas, at the behest of and with the aiding and abetting of Iran, was able to commit genocide against the Jewish people, I believe the Jewish people deserve justice. And this is not unique. Iran is culpable for murdering Jews around the world. AMIA, 1994 in Buenos Aires. The Argentinian courts determined that Iran was culpable for the bombing of a Jewish community center. In Bucharest, a bus full of Israeli tourists was bombed. In Thailand, Jews and Israelis attacked, all by Iranian agents. If we keep seeing this and nobody wants to act, then somebody must. And so we acted.
What role does Qatar play in all this? Because we know they also support and finance Hamas and shield them and all that.
That's a great question. I think something should be done. The Qataris are in a very unique position, though, as a major non-NATO ally to the United States. Everybody seems to want to protect them. But the question I have is, if it took just a little pressure from them, just a little bit, to go to Hamas and say, you need to release all the hostages, what were we doing for 2 years? 2 years ago, this could have ended. If it was just a little pressure from Qatar and now Turkey as well to say, you need to lay down your weapons, what have we been doing for 2 years? So I think that we should actually explore Qatari culpability and influence in the United States and around Europe as well. That is something that's quite alarming, that they have been able to buy influence, gifting the United States a 747 that's not going to be ready to be used until the end of this current presidency is very interesting. Their Northwestern University relationship is very interesting. These are things we should investigate. And I think Congress has a duty to investigate.
Do you have any final message to leave us off with?
I think that it's important that we understand it is Hanukkah right now. The world has become a very dark place for us as the Jewish people. But the only way that changes is if we show the world the light of the Jewish people and if we fight back. And fighting back doesn't necessarily mean on the battlefield in Gaza. It also means in the courtrooms. It means in the media. It means pushing back on politicians who use the genocide blood libel. Show them the truth. Show them what genocide actually is. There's plenty of resources out there. Scholars for Truth About Genocide is one. Show them the law. I was able to change the mind of a member of Congress saying like, hey, no, that's not how that works. And here's why. And having a very honest conversation. We can all do something to change the course of where history is headed. And we should.
I want to thank you for your time and your expertise, and keep on fighting. And we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course.